Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. It is Wednesday, October 22nd. I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. It's day 747 of the war. Hi, Jacob.
Hi, Jessica. Good to be with you again.
Good to be with you. Hamas handed over the bodies of Tamir Adar and Ari Zalmanovich, both from Kibbutz Nir Oz. Adar was killed fighting the October 7th invasion. Zalmanovich was declared dead in captivity. Today, family and friends will bury Tal Chaimi, who headed the Kibbutz Nir Yitzchak emergency response team. His body, taken captive, recently returned. There are now 13 deceased captives left in Gaza. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance is in Israel for his visit. He said the ceasefire is going better than he expected. We'll talk about the details of his visit, as well as the ceasefire headquarters where he visited in the town of Kiryat Gat. Stay with us. Okay, Jacob, let's talk about Vice President J.D. Vance. His latest headline that we have on our pages is there is lots of work to do in terms of the ceasefire, but doesn't seem too concerned that it's going to end, feels that the media tend to drum up this line very quickly as soon as anything happens. What's your sense after covering his visit yesterday?
Yeah, when in doubt, blame the media. So I think he had a few messages that he wanted to send while in town. He's actually going to be here for a few days, I think at least through Thursday. But we're talking about him starting off by, as you mentioned, that things are going better than we expected. I'm not sure exactly what they were expecting. Maybe that's a reference to Sunday's little blip where you had those two IDF soldiers that were killed in an attack in Gaza, and then Israel responding with a wide range of airstrikes throughout the Strip. But the fact that it got settled down after that, the U.S. managed to bring both sides back from another resumption of the war. I guess that's what he's maybe referring to, and better than expected. But in addition to kind of pushing this line of more optimism and this framing of that things are going okay, is that at the same time he wants to kind of lower expectations. That this is going to take a long time is one of the phrases that he used, both in terms of phase one, which was the hostage prisoner swap, which is not completed yet because all the bodies have not been returned. And with him stressing that it's going to take time to get those bodies, especially because I think this is the first time official publicly has revealed this, that they don't even know where all the bodies are. That is something that I think Hamas has been saying privately to the mediators, but I haven't heard a U.S. official say that for the first time publicly and acknowledging that. So that's obviously going to take time if they don't know where they are. But he stressed that doesn't mean that we're giving up on them. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner said the same thing in this press conference. We're going to continue until we find every one of those bodies. That's on phase one. Phase two is something that President Trump has said started already, but in reality, there was no agreement on phase two. That was the issues. All those post-war management issues like disarmament haven't really been actually agreed upon. The U.S. says that Hamas has to disarm, and Trump claims that he met with Hamas and that they told him that they would do so, and then he walked it back and said, well, no, it was Witkoff and Jared who had that meeting. Regardless, there was no actual written document where they agreed to disarm. So this concept of getting them to do so, or even getting other countries on board to help in that process, still needs to actually be finalized. So those two processes, as a result, are going to take time, is what he stressed. While doing so, he was very careful to thank the Israeli government and say that they're doing, Prime Minister Netanyahu and Ron Dermer and others involved in this process are doing an excellent job. I think pushing back on what you mentioned is what he called this media narrative, that everyone's trying to frame things as a crisis. I think that's happened definitely in other administrations as well. But it's coming against the backdrop of this report in the New York Times a few hours before J.D. Vance landed, which is that the U.S. is concerned that Prime Minister Netanyahu will try and break the ceasefire. So I think whether or not that was true, there was an effort by the Trump administration and Vance personally to push back on that concept. And one of the ways he did that is by saying, look, there's going to be blips. These things that maybe happen on Sunday, that's going to be part of this process. We can expect these hiccups, but that doesn't mean the ceasefire is breaking down. It's just because we have two sides that hate each other. That's what J.D. Vance said. On the other hand, you have this little bit of Bibi-sitting that's going on.
Right. Marco Rubio is also on his way, right? So it's got to have someone by his side.
Apparently, I mean, this you had this in the Biden administration as well. Maybe they would refer to it the same way. But the fact that you constantly have U.S. officials coming at from the highest level to go to Israel right now to make sure this is in play, maybe you could argue that it's not about checking on Bibi, but just checking on the situation in general. But that's, I think, one narrative that's coming out of the media right now that that Netanyahu needs to be tamed in, or just at least prevented from acquiescing to the calls from the far right of the coalition to resume the war. So in addition to J.D. Vance here now and Trump here last week, we have Marco Rubio, and then who knows the next cabinet secretary that will follow him.
And we have Bezalel Smotrich in the States.
Yeah, that's a good point. And
So one of the far right members of the coalition is sort of out of the scene for the moment, which probably makes it a little bit easier for Bibi to continue doing what he's doing.
well, it seems like the reason that they brought him, that they invited him to the States was for this meeting with Scott Bessent. I don't think it was as much to talk about financial cooperation, even though they're both Treasury chiefs. It was the statement that the Treasury Department issued after their meeting was to say that Scott Bessent urged Smotrich to fully embrace the Trump peace plan because Smotrich was one of the several right-wing ministers who voted against the phase one of it in terms of, I think he came out against the concept of releasing many Palestinian security prisoners, and also the idea of leaving Hamas. He felt still in power enough to carry out another attack. So the fact that they publicly said that they want him to fully embrace this, it's not going as far as to criticize him for doing so, but clearly there's some reading him. It's not very hard to read between the lines of that decision to highlight that from their meeting. So a good point to bring up about that this is happening both in Israel and in the US. I think what was a couple other interesting things from this press conference that I thought would be worth mentioning is this, again, the question of Hamas disarmament came up. I think the favorite question from reporters, or one of them, is what's the timeline for disarmament? And JD Vance was adamant about not giving one, but simply saying if they don't disarm, they're in trouble. I think there's a lot of questions about how they're going to go about doing that. One of the answers has been through this ISF, this International Stabilization Force, that's supposed to replace the IDF, but there hasn't really been a finalization of that process. They didn't name any of the countries that will be involved. And I think the fact that there's no timeline does hint that this is going to take a little bit of time. And what they're trying to do in the interim is focus on, there's two parts, there's basically two Gazas right now. You have the part that is under the IDF control on the Israeli side of this called the Yellow Line. That's about 50+% of Gaza. And then the part that's closer to the coast, which is still under theoretically Hamas control. So the idea Jared Kushner talks about is that we're going to focus on the Israeli side and pushing funds and reconstruction there, and hoping that will serve as a model for other places. But the tricky part about that is that I'm not sure you get the support of the Arab world to only focus on parts of Gaza, whereas and not other parts. Especially if Hamas is still in that other 50% of the strip. And I think it's also going to be a question of whether Palestinians move into those parts, because right now there's only, maybe it's several thousand, maybe it's a little bit more, but the vast, vast majority of Palestinians right now are in, unfortunately, the Hamas-controlled areas. I think still unsure about moving into IDF-controlled areas. Yes, that the U.S. is framing it as relatively more safe than those Hamas areas where those executions are taking place, but I think the narrative and I'm seeing in Palestinian media is that this is going to be another West Bank situation where I don't think these Palestinians feel particularly safe in Area C or other places where there's technically Israeli control. So I think there's going to be a real question of whether they're going to move forward with this two Gazas approach or try to keep it all together and have one unified approach for both in terms of political and security measures. And the last thing that I just wanted to mention from the press conference was there was a question that actually our colleague Lazer Berman asked about the role of Turkey. Because Turkey has been a very problematic player in the eyes of Israel, has been incredibly critical of Prime Minister Netanyahu, that is President Erdogan, and it plays, I guess you could say, the backup host for Hamas when they're not in good ties with Qatar. But Trump is very close with Erdogan and trusts him, and I think actually that relationship was critical of getting this deal across the finish line. And therefore, it seems like the U.S. wants Turkey to play some role. Vance acknowledged that Israel will have to sign off on any foreign force that will be on what he said Israeli soil, which is kind of interesting how he referred to Gaza as Israeli soil. Maybe that was a slip of tongue, but that is what he said. And at the same time, we think that every country has made mistakes, JD Vance says, when referenced about maybe hosting or helping Hamas, and that nobody is not at fault here, including Israel, and therefore we want to be moving forward. And if Turkey wants to help, we think that they can play an important role. So those were, I think, the main headlines that came up to me from this press conference. But we'll see more from JD Vance on Wednesday and Thursday.
Right. He's meeting with Netanyahu this morning, Wednesday. That's the plan. All right. So let's take a quick break. When we're back, let's talk about the ceasefire headquarters where JD Vance actually gave this parts of this statement yesterday in Kiryat Gat. So stay with us. Okay, so Kiryat Gat, which is town towards the south, happens to be where the Kibbutz Nir Oz community has been temporarily living for nearly 2 years. And that is also the location for this ceasefire headquarters, where this press conference took place yesterday with Vice President J.D. Vance. And it seems to be a very interesting kind of place with a lot of different nationalities and people who are working there together. Tell us what you're hearing about it, Jacob.
Yeah, Kiryat Gat now is not only known as the sister city of my hometown of Chicago, but also the host of this very impressive list of countries that are going to be part of this CMCC, which stands for Civil Military Coordination Center, another acronym to throw on to the list of ones that I have to memorize. But there were some flags that were put out when Vance came for this press conference, in addition to a blow up. I thought it was the Declaration of Independence. It's actually just the 20-point Trump plan that was.
Highlighted.
Yes, I guess interesting posters that were put up next to, you had to zoom in to see the words, but that was there. So the flags that were there with Vance, who are sending countries that are sending troops, this is not the same as sending troops to the ISF, the foreign force that will be going into Gaza. These are just simply troops that will be helping with the coordination and monitoring of the ceasefire from afar. So there is the US, of course, Canada, the UK, Germany, Denmark, and Jordan. Jordan was noteworthy given it's the only Arab country, not the warmest relationship with Israel, but I think maybe under a little bit of pressure from the US to take part in this, and I think they are important in the humanitarian file. So there were Jordanian troops at this press conference, and before when JD Vance was meeting at the CMCC, I think he met also with representatives from the Jordanian armed forces. But the rest of it was more of the Western world represented there. I think it's going to take a little bit more time to get other countries involved. I know that Turkey and Egypt and Qatar are going to be involved in the CMCC as mediators in this, but I think the fact that this is being held inside Israel and not Egypt, which was, I think, this concept of a CMCC was actually first born in the Biden administration, the idea was to have it in Egypt. And in order to have everyone there in one place, I guess maybe the approach now is either to give Israel maybe some sort of a nod and a gesture of legitimacy by having it there, or possibly another way of the US to really keep closer tabs on Israel, given that now you don't have to send representatives from abroad. It can be, everyone who's important will be nearby, if not in the CMCC, then also somewhere in Tel Aviv and the Kiryat or other places very close for the US to be able to be in close contact with the Israeli officials. But basically what this concept is to have a hub to try and monitor the way the ceasefire is going, to allow countries to adjudicate allegations from either Israel or Hamas of ceasefire violations, or simply be in charge of anything that's going into Gaza. So for the most part, that means humanitarian aid, but it also has to do with at least what CENTCOM's commander, the head of this is the U.S. forces in the Middle East for the most part, saying that it also is going to have to do with the security forces that are going into Gaza. So everything's going to be kind of starting from this hub, and hopefully that will serve as a model, not just for Gaza, what JD Vance says, but also other areas. We're trying to replicate this and maybe have some sort of CMCC actually to help with the Russia-Ukraine war, which the U.S. is having a hard time wrapping up. But at least they want to try to use this model that they're starting with in terms of trying to mediate this Gaza ceasefire. Notably, there are 200 U.S. forces that helped set this up, and they were under the command of Bradley Cooper, the the admiral, not the actor.
This is in the last 2 weeks, 10 days?
Yeah, this was set up pretty quickly. Now, I think, again, this is because not a lot of these concepts that came into place now were discussed in the previous administration under the previous CENTCOM also. So it's not like they were coming flying blind here and they knew that they were running, but getting this up very quickly was, I think, to the credit of CENTCOM, and I think actually will play a very important role. CENTCOM will. I think there's a lot more trust between the countries at the military level than there is sometimes at the political level, and hopefully that will then trickle up or trickle down, depending on how you're looking at it, to broader cooperation between the countries. But a lot will depend on whether you can get commitments from countries to actually join the ISF. I think what's happening right now is you have a lot of assurances, but nothing in there's no action being taken yet. I think you've had Indonesia say that they're willing to send 20,000 troops to be in this ISF. You have, I reported about Azerbaijan and Turkey also letting US officials know that they're willing to contribute troops, but that actually hasn't happened yet. And I think Trump is out there tweeting and talking about how all these Arab and Muslim countries are reaching out to him to say that they're girding for the opportunity to take on Hamas in Gaza if they don't behave. That is adamantly not what I'm hearing from Arab and Muslim country diplomats who say that yes, they might be willing to send troops to help maybe monitor the border or help with easier issues, but definitely not going into combat against Hamas forces deep in Gaza. There's very little win, and think about it, if the US isn't willing to do that, why should we be expecting definitely other countries to do the same? So it's, yes, there are benefits that the US is looking to give those countries that get involved, and that's why I think Indonesia is jumping on the opportunity. But there's a difference, I think, between willingness to send troops to do more jobs in Gaza, like training troops, versus actually fighting Hamas. And the disarmament issue is really going to be much more difficult, and I think will determine whether or not a lot of this is going to be successful.
Right. I'm just thinking about what is lunchtime like near this ceasefire headquarters. It must be like kind of crazy, everyone lining up at the falafel stands. Come on. Quite a mix of people.
Hopefully it can improve the Kiryat Gat culinary scene. Hopefully it's standing up to the challenge.
Well, I might have to make a trip down there, so we'll see, just to see what it looks like. I'm curious. I'm very curious. All right, Jacob, I think we are at the end of this particular daily briefing. Yes?
I think so.
Okay. So thanks for all your highlights and info. It's been helpful to hear and to understand. And thanks to you for listening to this Times Visuals Daily Briefing. Stay tuned for tomorrow's installment. This episode is produced by the Podwaves. Always feel free to recommend us to other listeners and rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, take care and be well.